Right, so we just created a hello world component, but it was somewhat painful, right? We had to create the class and then declare it and create the template and create all. So ideally, typically you're not gonna build these components from scratch. The more common way of doing this is that you would use the ng, right? The ng command we installed just a minute ago, right? To give us a leg up. You create already these boilerplate files for us, so that we don't have to start from scratch. Right? So we can say ng generate component, right? And then the name of the component you want to build. And then for you, it'll build all the 4 files for you. Okay? It'll create a CSS file. It'll be empty. There's nothing in there. Also an HTML file, which will have some dummy HTML in there, like 3 lines that typically you'll just throw away. A dummy test, and also a dummy component. It'll be a bare bones component, right? Which will load the components. It'll annotate the class. It'll create the class, and it'll create like an entry point to your component, right? So typically, this is what you will do. The ng, these words generate a component. They can be abbreviated, right? And you can say ng, g, c, and then the name of the component, which is the same thing, right? It's an alternative if you don't want to type too much. Once if you go into app components, you can overwrite the content of the hello world 2. If you go into hello world 2 dash component, you can overwrite and say h1 hello world 2, right? And then it would render your hello world 2 without doing basically nothing, right? If your content is just HTML, the only thing you would manipulate is the hello world 2, reference it in your component, and then edit your component whatever you want it to render. Okay. If you open it up, right? If you open up the actual files that it generates, you'll find that in the TypeScript file, it will look something like this. The class will have the name of the file that you gave it. Notice that it will camel case the name of the file. So if you say hello dash world dash whatever, right? It will automatically convert that into camel case, right? Removing the dashes and capitalizing every word, right? Also, it's not shown here, but it also have the annotation of the component, pointing to the correct CSS, pointing to the correct HTML, and declaring the tag. Okay, that's not shown here. A couple other things declared here. It'll have it'll also implement an interface. It'll implement an interface, the onInit interface, and the onInit interface declares a single method, and the method is called ng onInit. This is the equivalent on component did mount. Right? This will be called whenever the component is rendered. Right? It'll just notify you. Right? It says, hey, I'm going to render anything you want to do. So this will be a perfect time to update your state, to fetch data, to handle any initialization would be here. Okay. Also, it will declare a constructor, an empty constructor, right, which is again is the equivalent of the constructor, but there's no props. There's no equivalent of props here. Also, here in the class, you can declare any variable, any class level variable that you declare is considered the state of the component, right? So any variable that you declare is the equivalent of declaring a this.state and all the state variables that you would declare in there. Here, they're just class variables, just plain old class variables. Any class variable that you declare in here are readily available on the HTML. Any variable that you declare here at the class level, right, are readily available on the HTML. So for instance, in the HTML template that is associated to this component, you can just refer to variables that are declared in the class. Right? So for instance, we declare a message variable, right, that has a value. I can reference it in the template by using this escape sequence double curly bracket. right? Double curly bracket, and then the variable name, and I'm rendering whatever the component renders, right? So one thing that that Angular stresses is that the component side, the TypeScript side, is completely ignorant of the HTML. Right? It has absolutely no idea what the rendering is doing with any of this, with any of the data. Right? Its only responsibility is to maintain the state, right? To handle events, update the state, right? Or fetch data. Its only responsibility is to provide data for the template, right? And the template responsibility, its only responsibility is to render that content, right? So there's a very clear distinction between the two. Whereas in React, you can go one way or another, and it's just considered good practice, right, to break it up, right, and have functional components, right, and have containers, right. So basically, they reach the same conclusion, right, but they don't force you to do anything here. It's really the only way that can be done. Make sense? Right. So there it is. So basically, the component declares the. Oh, that's pretty light. Those gray are supposed to be a little darker. Where the component contains both HTML and TypeScript. The variables declare, the values declared for the variables in the TypeScript are accessible in the HTML, and then they are used by the browser to render the DOM, right? And it replaces that dynamically to render and update the DOM.